In this lecture, we will survey the historical and literary context of Romanticism in preparation for a discussion of Charlotte Smith, Robert Burns, and John Clare. Romanticism is an intellectual and aesthetic movement, often typified by its focus on nature, feeling, imagination, and individualism. This is the basic textbook description of the movement. It'll serve to get us started, but we should take note that no movement is ever entirely unified. Not everyone focuses on the same exact issues in the same exact way, and in the Romantic period, we'll find this basic assumption to hold true. We'll see authors of various opinions, preoccupied with different concerns, and writing in different genres and styles. So, nature, feeling, imagination, and individualism, these are all fine concepts to broadly frame our introduction to Romanticism, but as we progress through this course, we'll also see how these concepts are reframed, emphasized, and de-emphasized with each author. Now let's look at the dates that encompass the Romantic period. As your Norton introduction, pages 3 to 30, tells you, people can define the Romantic period in a couple of different ways, depending on whether they're looking at the reigning monarchs, historical events, or major literary publications. For the purposes of our class, we'll say British Romanticism begins roughly around 1775 with the American War of Independence and ends roughly around 1837 with the ascension of Queen Victoria. So when I say roughly, again, it's with a caveat. It's because we shouldn't think of these literary periods as having hard and fast beginnings and endings. After all, it's not as though a poem written in 1774 can't have romantic qualities or be considered romantic, just as it's not impossible to observe romantic qualities in literature after 1837. In fact, John Clare, one of the romantic poets we're reading this week, produces works after this ending date. So keep these dates in mind, but know that they are not absolute. When people talk about Romanticism, then, they typically talk about it as a reaction against what came before, as an attempt to break away from classical conventions and cultivate native traditions that met the social and political attitudes of the time, to be something modern and new. And it's because of this kind of definition of Romanticism that some passionate people would even argue that we are still in a Romantic period today, that we're still trying to be modern and new, to be rebellious, to be unique or an individual. The reason why it's important for us to recognize this reactionary quality as one of the Romantics, though, is because it allows us to frame what Romanticism is and is not. Romanticism is a reaction against the previous period, that is, the Enlightenment, and the neoclassical art and literature of that period. The Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason, was influenced by the scientific revolution, which took place during the Renaissance or early modern period. So when you think about the Enlightenment, you should be thinking about a general shift from primarily faith-based reasoning to reason-based thinking instead. That is, rather than relying solely on the church for an understanding of the cosmos and each person's place in it, there's increasingly more emphasis on the use of individual reason, philosophy, and science to make sense of the natural world, as well as to reconceptualize humans as natural beings rather than necessarily spiritual ones. Again, none of this should suggest that we're moving from church authority to the privileging of scientific knowledge in an absolutely straight line. There are starts and stops, reversals, and so forth. So we'll see the conflict between religion and science continue well into the 20th century, and of course we're still seeing tensions between the two today. But again, broadly speaking, we can identify the Enlightenment as a time of moving towards reason and science. Neoclassical literature, then, which was the prominent aesthetic of the Enlightenment, combines the scientific revolution's focus on reason with the Renaissance revival of classical texts and concepts. The Renaissance revival of the classics is in part what helped to move art and literature away from church-based thinking towards humanist thinking. Humanism focuses on cultivating each individual to be the best that they can be, for instance, encouraging education of the individual so that he or she may determine his or her own beliefs about issues of philosophy, ethics, civics, etc. But the classics, and this is very important, believed that all art should only imitate nature, for it is in nature that all truths can be found and expressed. That is, the belief was that there is an order outside the artist's own mind that comprises a truer or greater reality than anything the artist can imagine or feel, and that order is nature. Therefore, it is the artist's job to articulate the persisting ideals of nature. Neoclassicists took this classical concept of ordered art and nature and combined it with the burgeoning scientific emphasis on reason to inform their art and lives. So, for instance, a neoclassicist of the 18th century would argue that all disorder is part of a larger order, Concordia discourse. A storm, although it may be momentarily destructive, ultimately brings life to the land. And it is through observations of such natural processes that people concluded that all bad things happen for a reason. Or as Alexander Pope, a neoclassicist, once said, whatever whatever is right. And just like the classics, the neoclassics believed that just as nature is ordered, so should we be. That our art should likewise follow a hierarchy, just as there is a hierarchy in nature from God to angels, humans, animals, plants, and minerals. Thus, in the 18th century, there was a strict decorum on how one should conduct his or her own poetic career and which forms one should use, epic or lyric, to communicate certain ideas and so forth. There was a proper way of doing all things. Finally, like the classics, neoclassicists believed that uniqueness is just a figment of an ignorant person's imagination, that the individual should only be a focus of study when he or she models the general constants of universal nature. Dr. Samuel Johnson, another one of the most prominent writers of the 18th century, actually once stated that the belief that one is unique is proof of one's ignorance. In short, the general idea of neoclassicism is that the cosmos and each person's place in it can be expressed in terms of reason, unity, harmony, and balance. Some of this carries over into Romanticism. A lot of romantics were holists, which means that they feel all things should be united and balanced. But what comprises this harmony differs from the neoclassicists. The Romantics stand against everything the Neoclassicists stand for. They reject the limitations of neoclassical and classical literature, defy the rationalization of nature, and celebrate the eccentricities of the individual. They felt that reason deadens nature or makes nature dull. The thinking was that science may reveal the mechanical laws of nature, but it can never reveal the soul of it. Facts can't tell us how to wrangle with issues like beauty, goodness, and truth. This is a response against the scientific revolution and its mechanization of the universe accomplished through the establishment of mathematical and natural laws, but it's also a response against the Industrial Revolution, which made it seem as though rural, simple life and nature were being forgotten, as people from the countryside abandoned villages to move to cities or simply turned the villages into cities themselves. This doesn't mean the Romantics didn't believe in an objective external reality beyond themselves, but it does mean that they valued the subjective or individual experiences of nature. Earlier we had said that classicism and neoclassicism saw the poet as a mirror of nature, that the poet shouldn't impart any personal feeling or imagination upon his rendition of nature, but instead should strive to capture nature's universal truths. And this is why classical and neoclassical art appear so clean, symmetrical, and unified. If neoclassical art and literature can be conceptualized as a mirror of nature, then romantic art and literature should be conceptualized as a lamp, where the individual poet's consciousness illuminates his or her sense of nature. That is, it is up to the individual to filter and recreate reality, or rather to imagine reality as he or she perceives it. Nature, in romantic art, then is not clean, symmetrical, and balanced. These would indicate that the poet has elevated nature to an ideal or reduced it to geometric lines and perfection instead of being ordered and harmonic. Romantic nature is free and organic, spontaneous, and changeable. Instead of being unified and rational, romantic nature is individual, personal, and focused on feeling. In fact, this is an age that validates feeling and subjectivity over reason and objectivity. On the screen, there are two paintings. Based on our discussion of neoclassicism and romanticism, I want you to guess which painting would be which. Which one would be neoclassical, which one would be romantic. So the one on the left, the Oath of Heredity, is neoclassical. Note the general symmetry and balance. There are 3 empty spaces under the columns foregrounded by 3 groups of people. The paint strokes are clean, as are all the lines created by the architecture and body poses. Even the subject matter, 3 brothers swearing fealty to their father and nation during a time of war, the men standing strong and rational as the women slump overcome by emotion, is all suggestive of those ideal and model behaviors stressed by neoclassicism. All of this is opposed to the painting on the right. J.M.W. Turner's The Slave Ship is a well-known romantic painting. In it we see slaves that have been tossed overboard, being preyed upon by the creatures of the sea. It was inspired by an actual event in 1781 when a captain had thrown slaves overboard in an attempt to collect the insurance money he had taken out on their lives. Framing this horrific scene are the vibrant and passionate colors of a sunset and storm. The irony of nature's beauty in contrast to the scene of mass murder in the sea makes what we feel as viewers more poignant. Rather than stress ideals like loyalty, strength, unity, and reason, then this painting, Turner's painting, stresses violence, disorder, and emotion. There are some specific qualities of Romantic literature I want us to focus on this week. As mentioned earlier, the Romantics emphasized feeling, and these feelings can be mapped out on a spectrum, with sensible feelings being on one end and sublime feelings on the other. Sensibility can be understood as referencing one's sensitivity to beauty, and thus sensitivity to feeling and morality. The theory around sensibility is that humans are born with a sense of the beautiful, which, when guided by reason, can be used to understand the good and the true. For instance, when we see a man dying on the street, this offends our senses. The scene scene may appear ugly or disgusting, and thus we know it to be a symptom of society's cruelties and injustices. However, sensibility must entail feeling tempered or guided by reason as well. A truly sensible person should have compassion for others, but only within reason. For instance, if you have a sibling who is constantly getting into trouble, stealing money, getting thrown into jail, etc., you love them, you try to help them, but after a while, if they keep persisting and don't change, reason dictates that you've done all you can and are no longer obligated to help them. This is how a sensible person thinks. They're not overly attached or naively blinded by their emotions. Think of sensibility as a type of feeling that is coming out of neoclassical ideals and rationality. It's not yet overwrought with sentiment, and because of its origins in the age of reason, it prizes truth and simplicity. In literature, sensibility is often announced by the presence of melancholy, which is a kind of thoughtful, introspective, or pensive sadness. You might also see nostalgia and quiet weeping as forms of melancholy that provoke feeling tempered by thought and reason. The weeping is often a device to erase the boundaries between characters and readers, to evoke empathy. However, even though humans are all born with a sense of the beautiful, the idea about sensibility is that we must continually exercise our sensibility or senses, just as we would a muscle. The more we exercise our sensibility, the more moral we become. If we can improve our sense of benevolence or goodwill towards others, then ultimately we can be capable of individually and collectively achieving a more virtuous state for ourselves and others. Thus, it is a poet's job to exercise readers' sensibility. It is partially in response to this philosophy and cult of sensibility that we see so many philanthropic social reforms tending to the rights of the poor, the enslaved, and the female towards the end of the 18th and early 19th centuries, that is, towards the end of the Enlightenment and beginning of Romanticism. On the other end of the spectrum is sublimity. Sublimity is a feeling that is elevated beyond reason, and it may be seen in some ways as an opposite to sensibility. Sublimity argues against the sensibility belief that beauty gives us access to the truths and ideals of the cosmos, whereas sensibility defines beauty as that which is perfect and symmetrical, just as those in Neoclassicism would. Sublimity defines beauty as imperfect. For instance, a peacock has a small head with a disproportionately large body. It's not symmetrical or balanced, yet we consider it beautiful. Or a beauty mark on a woman's face. It's not symmetrical, but it has been seen as a mark of beauty. Beauty is just superficial pleasure. Sublimity then argues that the way we can access the truths of the cosmos is to transcend reason, to feel nothing but feeling, and liberate ourselves from the strictures of enlightenment and neoclassical rationality. And we do this by confronting ourselves with that which evokes terror and awe or astonishment, something that makes us aware of our finiteness. For instance, when you stand at the edge of a cliff with a gaping chasm below, you are made aware of how small you truly are. Or when you stand before the ocean, calm and placid, reaching so far into the distance that it curves over the horizon, you're overwhelmed by its vastness. Or when you're standing outside in a raging storm, claps of thunder echoing overhead, you're astonished by the chaos. And this goes the other way too. You might experience the sublime by looking into the microcosmic worlds of cell life. You can experience the sublime when surrounded by total quietness, or violent sound, darkness, or extreme light, things that are powerful and in a sense make you feel great or small. Remember though, the most important feature is that the sublime emphasizes feeling beyond reason, whereas sensibility emphasizes feeling guided by reason. In the paintings on the screen, John Constable's painting on the left may be seen as sensible. The style still maintains that sense of balance and order from Neoclassicism, while starting to incorporate some disorderliness in the common scenes of labor in the foreground. Our eye is drawn by the horizon and meandering stream to the church steeple in the back, suggesting an ideal past to which we must return. And overall, the painting suggests nostalgia for a rural simplicity in the face of the time's rapidly industrializing landscapes. The nostalgia and the ordered structure of the scene allow viewers to reflect on the feelings it conveys. So in Constable's painting, we're not immersed in the violence and passion of emotion as we are in Turner's painting, which is a good example of the sublime. Turner's painting is an example of the sublime. Instead, we're directed by Constable to feel guided by reason. This week we'll be looking at poets that come from the tradition of sensibility and emphasis on feeling. We'll get to sublimity later. When people think of Romanticism, two big names usually pop up, William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. This is because it is Wordsworth and Coleridge who penned the seminal romantic work Lyrical Ballads and the 1802 preface that outlined what are now recognized as key romantic principles. For instance, that one should write spontaneously rather than methodically, use the vernacular rather than an erudite language, and speak about common people in life rather than the life life and doings of nobility. Other big names of Romanticism you might be familiar with are William Blake, John Keats, Percy Shelley, and Lord Byron. Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Blake are first-generation Romantics, while Keats, Shelley, and Byron are second-generation Romantics. And we'll talk later in the semester about what qualities seem to distinguish these two generations. But the fact is that when people think about Romanticism, they usually start with these big names. We're going to start a little earlier than these figures, though, and begin with Charlotte Smith and Robert Burns. By the end of this lecture, we'll also cover John Clare, who exhibits similarities to these two, but writes a few decades later. Charlotte Smith is sometimes called the first Romantic poet. Elegiac Sonnets, her collection of poems and essays published in 1784, predates the work of those like Wordsworth and Coleridge by about 15 years. In fact, when Elegiac Sonnets came out, Wordsworth was still just a student. This is an important point because Smith is a proper poet of sensibility upon whom later Romantic poets like Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, and Keats modeled and built themselves. Now, the thing about the cult of sensibility is that it arguably revolved around and was fueled by women writers. We're only looking at one female poet of sensibility, Smith, due to the constraints on time, but the association of sensitivity and feeling with women is one that was prominent enough that later Romantic poets felt the need to address it and its fit with their male personas. This is why Wordsworth's preface to lyrical ballads insists that poetry is a, quote, real language of men, and that the poet is a, quote, man speaking to men. It is in part also why the philosophy of sensibility morphs into the more violent feelings of sublimity and madness that we see in second-generation Romantic poets like Shelley and Byron as the period progresses. These more aggressive emotions were seen as more suitable for the male writer. Even so, even though female authors were freely associated with a literature of feeling, they had to tread carefully as well. It was not considered feminine or appropriate to dwell on one's own feelings or to express excess of feeling. This would be egotistical and unladylike, since it makes a spectacle of the female author, making what should be private, the female mind, public, the public sphere of literature and open discussion being defaulted as a place for men. Smith broke other rules as well as a female writer. She was openly political. In the 1780s, we see the end of the American Revolution and beginning of the French Revolution, two big controversies that fueled political debate in Britain. And Smith engaged this debate by publicly attacking the hypocrisies of Britain's supposedly Republican ideals, espousing freedom, opposing war, and supporting the French Revolution. In all, she contributed greatly to the political conversations in Britain. For all this, though, Smith had a pretty typical upbringing for her time. She was born to a well-off family, received an education typical for a genteel woman, and then was married off at the age of 15 to an abusive, licentious man, Benjamin Smith, to whom she bore a dozen kids. It was when her husband was imprisoned for debt that she wrote and published elegiac sonnets to pay for her husband's release. She eventually left her husband, but being a woman from a wealthy family, she didn't have any other real marketable skills that labor women had other than writing, so she continued to write to support her children. She wrote fiction as well, and was quite successful there too, but we'll focus on her poetry, and one novel thing that she did with her poetry was revive the sonnet form. The sonnet is a 14-line poem that traditionally focuses on unrequited and ideal love. There are different rhyme schemes that are usually employed, but English sonnets in particular are typified by their ending couplet, that is, two last lines that are made to rhyme with just each other in order to emphasize a position or point. The sonnet was originally a form dominated by male writers in the Renaissance period, but Smith adopts a sonnet form, and since as a woman she could not speak openly about romantic obsessions as male writers of the past had, she shifted the tone of her sonnets to focus on melancholy and nature and introduced a kind of lyrical romantic sonnet that later poets like Wordsworth, Shelley, and Keats would employ. As a part of her melancholic and sensibility perspective, and as a poet coming out of Neoclassicism and going into Romanticism, she also gave quite a bit of attention to what we might call scientific observations, for instance, describing nature in terms that would only be available to a person who's informed, at least a little bit, about the latest theories about astronomy or optics. Now let's move on to Robert Burns. You're probably more familiar with Burns than you might expect. We've all heard this New Year's song. This song comes from Burns's Auld Lang Syne, one of the poems we'll be reading this week. Burns is a peasant poet, which means he wasn't classically educated, but rather speaks as one who comes from the land and common people about the land and common people. As we might expect of one born to a God-fearing farmer in Scotland, his youth was spent in heavy labor in the fields. He was not refined. He bore many illegitimate children to many different women, told bawdy tales, and happily proclaimed himself a radical, or as your Norton intro says, a, quote, free-thinking son of Satan. He did manage to read quite a lot on his own. He was largely self-educated, and so he should be considered more well-studied than John Clare, who is the other peasant poet we'll look at this week. But one thing that sets him apart is that he wrote in his native Scots, the language used at the time by the Scottish people. You can actually hear how one of the poems, To a Mouse, should be read in its original Scots in this recording by Sean Kane.
Wee sleekit, cowering, timorous beastie, oh what a panic's in thy breastie! Thou needna start to war sae hasty wi' bigger and brattle.
That Burns wrote in Scots is significant because most renowned poetry in the late 18th century was still using a fairly erudite style and vocabulary, one that could showcase a poet's advanced knowledge and privileged class. Burns instead represented his folk culture. This is a distinctly romantic thing to do. We call it making the ordinary extraordinary. But to be more specific, this kind of aesthetic has the capacity to protest against the corruptions of aristocracy and instead insist upon the simplicity of folk life. It's a return to nature and simpler times in the face of industrialization, and a translation of the revolutionary politics of the time into a democratic poetry. In fact, it is with Romanticism that we start to see a modern aesthetic that gives voice to the downtrodden, disgraced, and outcast, including slaves, women, and non-humans, animals. Again, all these ideas will become more codified over a decade later, when Wordsworth would finally publish the preface to his lyrical ballads and declare the polemical importance of writing about humble and rustic life with a common language. But with poets like Smith and Burns, we can see how Romanticism aggregated and eventually grew into what it was by the early 19th century. John Clare differs from Smith and Burns in that he comes to us from the early and mid-19th century, from the other end, the tail end of the Romantic period. Like Burns, however, he is a peasant poet, and perhaps even more of a peasant poet than Burns was. Clare was the son of a field worker and illiterate mother. He was solidly of the laboring class and poorly educated. He had no substantial opportunity for schooling, and we can see evidence of this in his writing. He uses the country dialect of Northamptonshire. There are also times where words are simply misspelled or made up in his poems, a quirk which he vehemently defended as a point of pride, distinguishing him from what he felt were the tyrannical tastes of the middle-class readership. As he said, grammar is a, quote, bitch, and he'll, quote, never be her slave. So when you're reading his poems, sometimes you'll encounter a word that won't have a definition in the dictionary because it's not a standard word in the English language. However, the same London society against which Clare at times balked is also the same society he at times desperately strove to belong to as he struggled to make a success of himself and feed his 7 kids. His life was full of hardship. He became an alcoholic, and eventually he lost his mind. He had delusions that he was the dark and brooding romantic poet, Lord Byron, that he had written Shakespeare's masterpieces, and that he had 2 wives. He was committed to an asylum by the 1840s, but continued to write, and in fact one of our poems, Peasant Poet, comes to us from this period when he had already descended into madness. Coming from this background, we can expect Clare's poetry to be anything from raucous and ranting to simple, erotic, ecstatic, and despairing. He's often celebrated for being a pure, primitive genius rather than contrived and edited, but not everyone would agree. John Keats, another well-known romantic poet who incidentally also faced much denigration as a lower-class poet, criticized Clare for being too descriptive rather than meditative and philosophical like Wordsworth. Clare represents a class of peasant poets that early 19th century Britain treasured for their originality and authenticity.